So today we're here for Blair Family History, and we got two presenters. We got Nancy Blair Remington and is it Gayle Blair Urban, correct? Did I get that right?
Half right.
Half right. Okay. Well,
Gayle Blair Urban part is right.
Okay.
It was a teamwork effort.
Right. Yep. So I will turn that over to them, and they'll probably straighten up everything that I just screwed up. So.
Good afternoon. It's nice to see you all here today. My name is Gayle Blair Urban, granddaughter of Harry Blair, and on behalf of the George Blair family, I would like to thank the History at High Noon Committee for inviting us here today to share some Blair family history. For today's event, we will focus on the generation of Blairs who settled in Meade County. To put the Blair family timeline in perspective, Sturgis was founded in 1876. Meade County was organized in 1889, and the early Blair settlers arrived in this area in 1907. We have some photo boards on display that you'll see and some other items, and so you'll have a chance to look at those at some point, and there will also be a time for questions later on. Imagine that you are a 9-year-old boy living in northwestern Missouri, and your mother and father have both passed away. You are already learning to be self-reliant. While in your teens, you and your cousin decide to go to Dodge City, Kansas, and there you work as cowboys for an early day cattle outfit, developing experience and knowledge in the cattle business. This young man was George Harvey Blair, great-grandfather to several of us here today. After his cowboying days, George Harvey returned to Missouri with one of the supervisors from the cattle company and worked on his farm. It was there that George Harvey met Mary Stouffer, and they were married in Fairfax, Missouri in 1884. Their 5 children, all born in Missouri, were Annie, Enos, John, Harry, and Strother Blair. All 5 children completed the 8th grade, and Enos and John completed a short term at the business college in Tarkio, Missouri. George Harvey, crippled by arthritis, was now the father of a growing family, a daughter and 4 sons, and the Blair holdings in the Missouri area were too small for them to sustain the family. So it was that George Harvey sent his oldest son, Enos, 20 years old, to look for some land in the Black Hills, which they had seen advertised in a newspaper from Spearfish. Enos looked at the land south of Sturgis and liked what he saw. Enos bought the old Madison place, located in Upper Pleasant Valley, which included 50 head of cattle, 8 to 10 horses, and a homestead relinquishment, all for $7,000 in the year of 1907. A month later, Enos's younger brothers, John and Harry, 19 and 17, rode in a railway boxcar with household goods, some machinery, a team of horses, some chickens, and 2 pups. George Harvey and Mary Blair, along with their daughter Annie, who was 22, and son Strother, who was 15, came from Missouri to their new home in Pleasant Valley by passenger train to join their 3 sons. The George Harvey Blair family was now at home in Pleasant Valley. After 1900, George Harvey never walked. He had lost the use of his lower legs and toes due to arthritis or rheumatism. He had retained his independence by using a small handmade chair, which had flat wooden runners, and he had a pair of small handmade crutches which he could use to maneuver himself around in that chair. The house in Pleasant Valley, which the Blairs moved into, was one of the first frame houses built in the Pleasant Valley community. In earlier years, it had been a roadhouse, and it was a stopping point for those travelers on the Sydney-Deadwood Trail, where they could stop and water their oxen or horses or have a meal. The travelers who had stopped there when the Madisons lived on the place would stop years later and expect that the Blairs would still be carrying on the routine. Indians had camped in the area, and they continued to do so for some years. Those later visits from the Indians were a bit unsettling to some of the Blair women. The main source of family income at that time for several years was farming, beef cattle, hogs, and garden produce, and dairy products. One of the first carloads of hogs shipped out of Tilford was from the Blair Ranch. Down through the years, the Blairs shared work with their neighbors, Lambertons, Jordans, Jarvises, and Smiths, on such projects as threshing. They had a large enough crew on their own for the branding. Over the years, at their Pleasant Valley home, George Harvey and Mary had their family close by, and they continued to be a close-knit family whose members enjoyed working and playing together. Mary Stouffer Blair passed away in 1920, and George Harvey passed in 1922. They are buried in Sturgis at the Bear Butte Cemetery. So my sister will continue the family story.
Hello, I'm Mary Beth, not Nancy. I'm granddaughter of Harry Blair, daughter of George Blair. The 5 Blair siblings, Annie, Enos, John, Harry, and Straude, were all in their teens and early 20s when they came to this area. I'm first going to talk about the partnership they established and how that evolved. Harry Blair described that when he and John arrived at Tilford on the immigrant train in 1907, they heard the coyotes howling at night, and they thought they were really in the Wild West now. Though the initial Blair purchase in 1907 included only 480 acres, when Enos turned 21 later that year, he filed on a homestead land that adjoined the ranch. So now the family owned an entire section. And 2 years later, John filed on a homestead claim on land just to the south. That added to their holdings, and that was the beginning of the partnership that continued for over 40 years. Their sister Annie was an active participant in the partnership and was a member of it. When she married, she received a cash settlement for her contributions to the early years of the partnership. The Blairs believed in strength in unity, and they worked together as their families grew and more land and more homes were acquired over the years. The Blairs were by no means the earliest settlers in Pleasant Valley. Close neighbors, the Lambertons, had arrived in 1879, and Jordans had lived there since the 1880s. Others had already come and gone. Perhaps they were discouraged by the blizzard of 1888 or other hardships. Thus, in the following years, there was additional land available for the Blairs to purchase. And in constructing their history, it's interesting to note that almost every parcel of land that they bought had changed hands at least twice already before. The first addition in 1908 was the Fred Lamberton place that was just down the road about a mile. Enos had married that year, he and his wife, Anna Newman, began their life there. The Blairs had to be resourceful to provide for their family. As noted earlier, in those days, they milked, they farmed, raised cattle and hogs, and garden produce, which they sold to Fort Meade and to Sturgis. They delivered those goods by wagon. John's wife, Lois, said that the wagon drive through the pines over to Fort Meade was just a beautiful drive. The railroad had arrived in Tilford by 1888, and that was another benefit, as they could ship their hogs to Rapid City or the calves up to Lead. The Slavanovich brothers in Lead usually paid them in gold coins, and they would get about $5 a head. In 1912, John made a trip to Wisconsin and bought a carload of Holstein cows. So then they shipped milk by rail from Tilford up to the Fairmont Cemetery Creamery in Deadwood for some time. In 1913, John was the next to marry. His wife was the former Lois Lamberton. And about the same time, after some dry years in South Dakota, Enos chose to move his young family back to Missouri. John and Lois moved to the ranch, where Enos had been living. In 1915, Harry married Elizabeth Johnson. She's commonly known by Bessie, so normally throughout this I call her Bessie instead of Elizabeth. The next year, they lived on the home place in Pleasant Valley. The next year, Annie Blair married Arthur Johnson and left the Blair partnership. So now the partnership was John, Harry, and Straude. The next land acquisition was 1916. They purchased the Lutz Myers place, which was just south of the National Cemetery. That was John and Lois's home for several years, and their children rode horseback down to the Pleasant Valley School, which was about 2 miles away. In 1918, the home place was enlarged by the purchase of the Patterson Towler place, which was just to the north. And they also bought part of a school section in that year. And then in 1919, the Blairs bought a few Herefords. And then a bigger expansion and the real beginning of the Blair brothers' Hereford operation was in 1921. They bought the O.J. Hanson Ranch, which was 1.5 miles east of Tilford. That was purchased by John, Harry, and Straude. And with that purchase came a herd of registered horned Hereford cattle. And that was the beginning of the Black Hills Hereford Ranch. So now the 3 main properties were all connected, and it extended along present-day Interstate 90 from Blucksburg all the way to Tilford. Tilford was a busy little town in those days. It had a post office, 2 hotels, and at least 1 grocery store. A community club was organized in the 1920s, and the Blairs participated in many events there. In the 1960s, while we were going through our grandmother Bessie Blair's trunk, we found a handbill for a play that was entitled A Family Affair that was given in Tilford. The cast members included Bessie Johnson, John Blair, Straude Blair, Fred Jordan, and Lois Lamberton. So this was all before all of them were married. Throughout these years, the brothers always collaborated and worked together to brand, dip cattle, fill silos, or whatever was needed. The wives would arrive early and prepare meals. The brothers did much of their own blacksmithing, horseshoeing, and machinery repair. On the original ranch, they created a place to shoe their oxen. It was anchored, a thick board was anchored between 2 oak trees. And that's in the photo there now. The board is obscured now as the trees have grown together. In the early 1920s, they replaced their Percheron horses with a tractor that the brothers shared and used at all 3 ranches. In the spring, it would run day and night to get the plowing done. My own recollection, as told by my dad, George Blair, is that they got electricity there on the home place in 1927. Before that, they had carbide lights and a generator that they could use just a few hours each day. John, Harry, and Straude began holding annual bull sales, and throughout the 1920s, they shipped livestock by rail to Omaha. And I believe from what I've read that often one of the brothers would go along to Omaha with the livestock. And they also showed their stock at local fairs. By the 1930s, they were even more involved, showing their stock at the South Dakota State Fair and at Hereford shows. For years, the Blair brothers were synonymous with registered Hereford cattle. They worked to develop favorable breeding characteristics in their bulls. Bloodlines represented were Beau Donald, Battle Mischief, Battle Domino, Bocaldo, Stanway Domino, and Blocky Domino. In 1930, the Enos Blair family returned to South Dakota, and Enos bought an interest in the Blair brothers partnership. Enos moved on to the ranch next to the Black Hills Cemetery, and on that ranch in about 1940, the Blairs built a round barn for their annual bull sales. This barn was constructed of vertical pine logs on a concrete footing, and it still stands along I-90, just south of the Black Hills National Cemetery. According to an article in the 2020 edition of the South Dakota Magazine, the Blairs hired an old-timer with a mule team to cut the logs. He skidded them down from the big hill to the west and brought them down to the site where the barn was built. It's the only remaining round log barn made of logs in South Dakota. Rich Blair, one of the later generations of Blairs, told me that his father Veldon designed the barn. The words Black Hills Hereford Ranch were painted on the roof, and a pen of registered bulls was visible from the highway. In the 1990s, the barn's current owners invited some of us to tour the barn, and they told us that they had to do a whole lot of shoveling to clear out the barn, and they had replaced all of the windows. They gave us some of the original windows, one of which is on display here. During the hard times of the 1930s, the Blairs reduced the size of their herd and struggled to feed them, as did many others. The sugar beet company up at Belle Fourche allowed ranchers to turn their cattle onto the fields after fall harvest, and they used the beet stalks for winter forage. The Blairs tried that for at least 1 year. The following spring, which was the spring of 1931, they trailed the cattle home. George and Veldon Blair, all of 9 years old, were involved in that part of the adventure. The weather took a bad turn. It was cold, rainy, sleety, very unpleasant. They stopped in St. Ange for the night and got a hotel. However, the heat in the hotel had been turned off for the winter. So the boys were wearing 3 layers, including their coats, and they were still freezing all night long. The next day was no better. When they got to Whitewood, Harry told George to ride on ahead by himself, go to his Grandma Johnson's house in Sturgis, and put up his horse in the shed there before he went into the house. Our dad, George, said that was the coldest he ever was in his life. Fast forward to 1948. The Blair brothers' holdings totaled more than 65,000 acres. They registered more calves than any other cattle operation in the state. But also by then, the sons and daughters of the brothers were grown and raising families of their own. It was time to dissolve the brothers' partnership. Enos started a new partnership, Enos Blair and Sons, with Donald and Veldon. Veldon lived on a ranch north of Bear Butte, now operated by his descendants, the new Blair brothers. John and his son Calvin stayed on the ranch east of Tilford and took the Black Hills Hereford Ranch name. Today, it's no longer called the Black Hills Hereford Ranch, but John's grandson, Bruce Blair, continues to operate at that location. Harry and his son George established the South Dakota Hereford Ranch, and this included the home place in Pleasant Valley, plus land in Harding County that had been acquired in 1946. Harry later operated other ranches in western South Dakota and eastern Montana. In addition to the fathers and sons just mentioned above, the other children of the original Blair settlers also continued the ranching tradition. Annie Blair Johnson's son, Ken Johnson, ranched north of Bear Butte. Enos's daughter, Janice Snyder, ranched with her husband, Clifford, west of Tilford. John's daughter, Lucille Johnson, ranched with her husband, Pete, in lower Pleasant Valley. I would venture a guess that not too many of you here today even remember all 5 of the original Blair children. So I'm going to give a little information about each of them and their spouses. And we'll begin with Annie Blair and her husband, Arthur Johnson. Being the oldest child and the only daughter, Annie learned household responsibilities at an early age. She was 22 when they moved to Pleasant Valley and was included in the family's partnership. And one of their early endeavors, which she took part in, was hauling produce and farm goods to Fort Meade. Since the Blair Ranch was near the Sidney Deadwood Trail and earlier owners had operated it as an inn for wagon trains, it wasn't unusual for travelers, gypsies, Indians to stop by, and more than once, Annie was startled by a stranger peering in the kitchen window looking for food or water. Apparently her brothers, maybe only some of them, were known to tease Annie. During the 1912 and 1914, the Pleasant Valley school teacher was Bessie Johnson from Bear Butte Valley. Bessie's brother Arthur Johnson would bring her over from Bear Butte. Valley, and Bessie boarded with the Blairs during the school week. So Annie took to baking a pie whenever she knew that Arthur was going to visit. And her brothers made an effort to go hide the pie and to tease her about it. So nonetheless, Annie captured Arthur's heart and they married in 1916. After marriage, Annie and Arthur moved to a ranch north of Sturgis on Cottonwood Creek, just northwest of Bear Butte. The place had been the home of a Frank Richards, and that had been one of the first homesteads in that part of Meade County. There, Annie boarded local school teachers. Arthur raised top Herefords and farmed with an eye towards conservation. They were active in community affairs. Arthur helped organize the Farm Bureau, and he kept up with local politics. They raised sons Orville and Kenneth on Cottonwood Creek. In 1953, they moved to Sturgis. They lived on Davenport Street, next door to Straude and Rose Blair, and right across the street from Harry and Bessie Blair. Another story that's been passed down is that one Halloween, Annie's brother Harry, dressed up in costume, he went across the street to trick or treat at Arthur and Annie's house. He acted very obnoxious, very greedy. And with him being short, he was only about 5'3.5" tall, it did not occur to Annie that this was her brother in disguise. So afterwards, he went home, he changed his clothes, he went back to chat with Arthur and Annie about how the evening had gone. And Annie said, well, it was good except for one big, rude kid. Harry was rather pleased with himself, but Annie did not appreciate knowing that she had been tricked. Both Annie and Arthur passed away in 1965. Enos Blair and Anna Newman Blair. Enos, the oldest of the four sons, he was only 20 when he was tasked with scouting a better place for his parents and siblings to live. They didn't have enough land in Missouri, and his father was crippled with arthritis, unable to walk. When he visited the Madison Ranch in Pleasant Valley in February of 1907, Enos did not hesitate. He felt that this was the right land for them, and the purchase was made. The next year, Enos returned to Missouri to marry his sweetheart, Anna Newman, and brought her to the ranch in the Black Hills. They lived about a mile from Enos's parents in Pleasant Valley. Pioneer life was a tremendous adjustment for the young bride from Missouri. 2 children, Janice and Donald, were born in Pleasant Valley. In March 1914, after 2 or 3 very dry years, Enos and family moved back to Missouri and ranched there. Their youngest son, Veldon, was born in Missouri. It wasn't until 1930 that the family returned to South Dakota. Donald had finished a year of college. Veldon was still in grade school. Enos bought into the Blair Brothers partnership, and he settled on the Blair Ranch just south of the National Cemetery. And at that time, Straude and Rose Blair moved into Sturgis. Some months later, Enos's daughter Janice and her husband Clifford Snyder also moved to the Black Hills, and several years later they established the Snyder Ranch west of Tilford. Enos especially enjoyed showing the Blair livestock at the state fair and other shows. He also hosted cattle judging schools for 4-H. He's helped found the Western Junior Livestock Show, helped organize the South Dakota Hereford Association, was a county commissioner, served in the state legislature, and enjoyed being involved in several community activities. Enos practiced range management, land conservation, and stewardship of the land, and he was honored by the Little International Show of South Dakota State University in 1949 for his contribution to the livestock industry in South Dakota. His wife Anna enjoyed gardening and entertaining. She canned, preserved, and always had a nice flower garden. She taught Sunday school for several years. In 1948, a girls' 4-H club was being formed, and it was Anna Blair who suggested the name Tilford Spruce Ups. It was a unanimous choice. It was an active club, and almost every girl in the Tilford and Pleasant Valley communities was a member at some time or another. After the Blair brothers dissolved their partnership in 1948, Enos and his sons Donald and Veldon formed the Enos Blair and Sons partnership, and that lasted about 13 years. Anna passed away in 1961, and Enos in 1969. The third child in the George Harvey family was John Blair. He was 19 when the family moved to Pleasant Valley, and when he turned 21, he filed on an adjoining homestead land. When he was 24, he married the neighbor girl, Lois Lamberton, who had been born in a log cabin in Pleasant Valley. Her nephew, George Blair, recalled hearing that all of her brothers cried when she got married. They would miss her cooking and cleaning. Actually, Lois didn't move far away. She and John were only 3/4 of a mile down the road. John and Lois and their three children, Calvin, Lucille, and Vesta, eventually settled on the ranch 1.5 miles east of Tilford, which the Blairs had purchased in 1921. By now, the Blair partnership was known as the Black Hills Hereford Ranch and was prominent in the South Dakota cattle industry. Calvin worked hand in hand with his father. John was perhaps one of the quieter Blairs. He had a special interest in organizing activities for young people in the area. When a baseball team was formed in Tilford in the early 1930s, he used his horse-drawn grader to smooth out an area on the ranch for a field. He was a talented craftsman, and he bought a lathe to make bats for each of the boys on the team. He determined that the white ash trees on the ranch made the best bats. The bats were so fine that one of the fathers would not even let his son use his bat. John also served as an umpire for their games. During the 1930s, the young men of Pleasant Valley also began looking for a place to build a hockey rink. The dams and creeks they had been using were not adequate. John and Calvin found a good spot on the ranch, and in September 1941, 8 of the area men each contributed $25 and spent every Saturday from September to December working on the rink. The work was finished, and they were ready to flood the rink on December 7th, 1941, when Lois came down from the house and announced that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. That ended work for the day. The rink was built mainly to play hockey, but word spread quickly, and soon recreational ice skaters were coming from all over the hills. The warming shack had a potbelly stove, wooden benches, and windows across the front, which looked over the rink. There were skates for rent, concessions for sale, coffee, soda, candy, and on special occasions, there might be roasted hot dogs. The ice skating provided good entertainment for the community. Often 4-H groups or church youth groups would come there for an outing, and the rink was operated until 1967. According to John's granddaughter, Linda Blair Hardenbrook, John also was known for some special holiday dishes. He made chili, oyster stew, fruit salad with whipped cream, and George Blair remembered that his Uncle John often brought a big pot of scalloped potatoes to family picnics. John also had lovely handwriting, and he often wrote the place cards for family dinners. John and Lois bought the former home of Annie and Arthur Johnson on Davenport Street in Sturgis in 1966. John passed away in 1970, and Lois and her daughter Lucille lived there for many years. Lois had a positive spirit, John's wife Lois. She had a positive spirit, a cheerful outlook, and lived all of her life in the community and made a difference wherever she was. She was a ranch wife and mother. She was the person who showed up first and left last, cooking, cleaning up, volunteering. Quilting was a favorite activity for her. She also loved the outdoors and puttering around. She never complained. She gave the best hugs. She said 2 of the most beautiful sights she ever saw were the view looking down into the Grand Canyon and the frost on the wire of a chicken wire fence. Lois lived to be 98. Harry Blair and Elizabeth Johnson Blair. Harry Blair was 17 when he came to Pleasant Valley. He had been born Benjamin Harrison Blair, but we surmise that he didn't care for that name. Once he came to South Dakota, he changed his name to simply Harry Blair. Though his education ended with the 8th grade, he had no shortage of knowledge or ability. In Missouri, he and his brothers learned ciphering method for performing math problems. There were even local ciphering bees, similar to a spelling bee. Harry's son George said that his dad could perform complex math, addition, or division in his head as fast as George could do it on paper. And I do have one of the math books here that the brothers shared. Pleasant Valley had some dry years shortly after the Blairs arrived. 1911 was especially bad. They shipped hay up from Nebraska, but it turned out to be mainly cheat grass. Harry went to Idaho for a while and worked for an uncle who had a dairy there. That wasn't his cup of tea. When he returned to South Dakota, he met Bessie Johnson. She was the Pleasant Valley school teacher, and she was boarding with his parents, George Harvey. They married in 1915, and they lived on the home ranch in Pleasant Valley, where they raised their children, Evelyn, George, and Mary. Evelyn and Mary commented that they never helped with ranch work because that wasn't considered ladylike. Their dad didn't want them to. How times have changed. Harry and Bessie moved to Sturgis after the dissolution of the Blair partnership. In fact, they made the move into Sturgis just before the big January 1st blizzard of 1949. They lived on Davenport Street in the house that Bessie's parents had built. The ranch in Pleasant Valley was operated by George Dobish until 1956, when Harry's son George and the family moved from a ranch in Harding County down to Pleasant Valley and took over the home place. Bessie always kept a big garden, did a lot of canning. She made homemade apple butter and homemade grape jelly. And she also did a lot of sewing, but she confessed in later years she really didn't enjoy sewing. She had a good education, attending Spearfish Normal School after high school and teaching school for several years before she married. One of her students at Pleasant Valley School happened to be Rosa Jordan, who became her future sister-in-law. Bessie's parents had settled in Bear Butte Valley in 1884, and Bessie was born in January 1889, just months before South Dakota became a state. She passed away in 1972. Harry was a confident man, definite in his opinions, with a positive attitude, full of ideas, and sometimes a bit of mischief. His grandchildren never saw him angry, and when he came out from town to help us with branding, things always went so much smoother. He got the idea that his Hackamore Ranch in Harding County needed some buffalo. So in 1967, he and his managing partner, Guy Dahl, tried that. Regular fences could not contain the buffalo. They were difficult to handle, and one particular bull was so troublesome that they butchered him. And Harry had a jacket made from his hide. Next, in 1969, he tried Longhorn on the Bell Tower Ranch in eastern Montana. Many laughed, but it turned out that the Longhorns were very profitable. Producing stock with the longest horns earned the most money. Harry served as South Dakota trustee on the National Cowboy Hall of Fame board in Oklahoma, and that may have been what fostered his dream for a place to pay tribute to the early settlers of the Western Plains. He and his good friend, Edgar Gardner, worked together to make this happen. A plot of land was found in Spearfish, and Harry was alive to handle the plow at the groundbreaking ceremony. The actual opening of the center was not until 1989. How time flies. Harry's early ideas about what the High Plains Heritage Center might look like have evolved into reality of an active heritage center which is of interest to people of all ages. And bus tour groups come through there seasonally, bringing visitors from across the U.S. who come to see the sights of South Dakota. Harry outlived all of his siblings, and up until the time of his death in 1983, he remained very active. He regularly climbed Bear Butte for Easter sunrise services, the last time when he was 91 years old. And I believe, do we have here in the an article written about Harry? Did you bring that? I don't have it. Okay. There was an article written in the Sturgis paper when he was 92 years old, shortly before he passed away, which was an interesting article. Straude Blair and Rose Jordan Blair. Strother, always known as Straude, was the youngest Blair. He was 15 when they moved from Missouri to the Pleasant Valley Ranch. In 1917, during World War I, the United States instituted a military draft for men ages 20 to 30. Straude was 26. He served in 4 important campaigns against the Germans in France during the summer and fall of 1918. Because he knew how to drive a team, he was assigned to a field artillery unit where he drove a mule team that carried the ammunition up to the front lines. One morning in the Argonne Forest, he arrived at the front lines and he was told that the army was getting ready to move forward so that they weren't ready for him to unload. So he left the mules hitched and he thought about he would lie down and take a nap, but then he realized that he had a friend nearby, so he went over to check in with his friend. As he and his friend visited, the Germans launched a few shells and the men took cover. Next, there was a huge explosion. Once the smoke cleared, Straude walked back to his mules and wagon. There was nothing left. This happened a month or so before the armistice in 1918. Straude brought home a 75 millimeter shell as a souvenir. It was decorated on the ship home by one of his shipmates, and it lists the campaigns in which he was involved. And we have that shell here today. After Straude passed away, his widow Rose gave that shell to my dad, George. And when World War II broke out, my dad, George, was getting ready to leave for active service. So he asked his uncle Straude if Straude had any advice for him. Without hesitation, Straude told him, "Stand in the back row. Keep your eyes and ears open and keep your mouth shut. And don't volunteer for anything." In 1921, Straude married a neighbor girl, Rosa Jordan, and they moved to the ranch east of Tilford, which the Blairs had bought earlier that year. And in August of the next year, their house burnt down. But with the help of the Blair brothers pulling together and a Sturgis carpenter, they had a new house by Christmas time. Rose helped organize the Country Culture Club in 1924 that welcomed all of the women from Pleasant Valley, Tilford, and the Morse Creek area to meet monthly, and they took turns hosting. That club continued for 50 years or so. And one of the teachers at the Lower Pleasant Valley School had been a roommate of Rose's in Spearfish Normal College. So Rose was very happy to have her friend board with her and Straude there on the ranch. Straude was president of the local telephone company in Lower Pleasant Valley. His duties also included being the secretary and the treasurer, plus he was responsible for maintaining the line. Telephone service was quite poor at that time. The telephone poles were just 2x4s nailed to fence posts. We understand that our Aunt Rose wasn't always happy with ranch life. She wrote of an occasion where 3 feet of snow fell in April 1927. They had fed the last of the corn. They had 2 train cars of steers and 1 of hogs that were ready to ship to Omaha. Straude drove a 4-horse team and the bobsled into Tilford to break a trail to the train station. Then he drove the cattle, followed by the hogs, single file to the rail cars. Rose was left on the ranch with 2 hired men. Another snowstorm delayed Straude's return from Omaha. Rose proceeded to bake bread and cake, churned butter, prepared sauce, and boiled a ham for the hired men. Then she rode a horse into Tilford. She swatted the horse on the hip and he went home by herself while she took the train to Sturgis and stayed there till Straude returned. Straude had some physical limitations from his military service, and in 1930 he and Rose moved into Sturgis. There he worked in the loan department of the First National Bank, and in 1935 he was appointed postmaster and served for 17 years until his retirement in 1952. He continued his involvement in community projects, from Sturgis School Board, Meade County Fair Booster, commander of the American Legion, and on the Lutheran Church Building Fund up until the time of his death. Tragically, Straude and Rose's only child, Beverly, died of a brain tumor in 1954 during her senior year in college at St. Olaf's in Minnesota. And a few years later, Sturgis developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he passed away in 1960. Rose continued to live in their house on Davenport Street in Sturgis for another 30 years. And during those years, she found pleasure in traveling, especially a trip to the Holy Land. So that covers the individual families and their spouses. I'll turn it back over to Gayle, who's got some human interest stories.
So the Blair family always seemed to find time for different social activities, taking outings to the Badlands and other places. So this was an experience that they had at the Strata Bowl. And it said that one of the national history-making events which the families witnessed was the launching of a manned balloon flight in the Strata Bowl just south of Rapid City. The National Geographic Society and the Army Air Corps co-funded the expedition. The flight was launched from a natural bowl in the hillside. The Box Canyon was an ideal place to launch, as the canyon walls would shield the balloon from any winds. On November 11, 1935, a helium balloon called Explorer 2 ascended from the canyon and reached a record height and took the first photo to show the curvature of the Earth against the backdrop of space. The Blair and Snyder families who were there on that November night had taken a tent for protection against the chilly temperatures. Some people built campfires with pitch wood to keep warm that night, and their faces were covered in soot the next morning. And then a perfect autumn day dawned, with an estimated 35,000 to 40,000 spectators there. Thick as ants all over the tree-covered hillside, as they eagerly anticipated the launch. As the balloon ascended from this natural bowl, it was a most impressive sight for all to experience. The first successful balloon flight into the stratosphere. Its record height of 72,395 feet was an altitude record which stood for 21 years. My dad, George, was 14 years old when he saw that balloon launch, and it was an incredible experience for him, something that he always remembered. This escapade is called Early Day Horse Thieves. The following event occurred in the latter part of November 1915. Harry and his wife Bessie were newly married and were living on the home place in Pleasant Valley with his parents. This is what happened as Harry wrote it down. 3 young men and 2 girls in the vicinity of southeastern Pennington County had stolen a covered wagon and 6 horses. 4 horses were with the wagon and 2 were saddle horses. One girl got cold feet and quit the bunch soon after they started. The thieves planned to start out for Montana, but a 6 to 8 inch snowstorm came up, so the horse thieves sort of lost their bearings and were coming up Pleasant Valley. We had telephones at that time, wrote Grandpa, and we got a message that they were coming up Pleasant Valley. As they were getting rather close to where we were living in Upper Pleasant Valley, and it was getting dark, we thought they would want to stay the night and get out of the storm. I called Sheriff Roy Scott and told him that they were getting close, and they would probably want to stay all night. So Sheriff Scott told me to tell them that they could stay all night, but he didn't think they'd really stay very long. The thieves with horses and wagons arrived at our place before the sheriff had arrived, and they asked to stay for the night. I went to the barn with 2 of the young men and showed them where they could put the horses and feed them. About that time, I looked out and saw the light of the sheriff's pickup. So I went down and told the sheriff that 2 of the young men were in the barn taking care of the horses. Jim Powell was with the sheriff, and they were in a Model T pickup, which had no top and a small box on behind. I decided I would go along to the barn and see how the sheriff handled the situation. The sheriff first told the boys that he was the sheriff for Meade County and that they would have to go with him to Sturgis. Then the sheriff and Mr. Powell searched the young men for guns. The sheriff told them to finish taking care of the horses and come down to the pickup. Then the sheriff went over to the covered wagon and said in a loud voice that he was the sheriff and that they would have to go to Sturgis with him. The one young man and the girl were still in the covered wagon, and the top was all tied down with ropes. The sheriff spoke the second time, but still there was no answer or movement from inside the covered wagon. The sheriff took out his pocket knife and started cutting the wagon ropes. Then he reached in and got a hold of one leg of the young man and pulled him out of the wagon. The girl came out next. The 6 of them, 4 thieves and the 2 lawmen, got into the Model T. There was no top, and with 6 or 8 inches of snow, it was getting real cold by that time of night. I said to the sheriff that he might have trouble on the O'Brien Hill, as the snow used to drift in that spot. He said he had shovels and lots of help. When I saw Sheriff Scott a few days later, he said they did get stuck on O'Brien Hill, but he had the horse thieves get out and do the shoveling and pushing. The next morning, a sheriff and 2 men from Pennington County came up, and they took the whole outfit. In summary, the Blairs worked hard to support their community and the cattle business. Areas of leadership included church, school boards, 4-H clubs, Meade County Fair, Western Junior Livestock Show, South Dakota Hereford Association, South Dakota Stock Growers Association, State Fair, local and state politics. In the 1940s, Enos served 1 term in the State House of Representatives, and Harry served a term in the Senate. In 1963, Enos was honored as Eminent Farmer by South Dakota State University. In 1967, Harry received the same award, while John was honored in 1967 by the South Dakota Hereford Association for his contributions to the Hereford breed. Later generations have followed in this strong tradition of community involvement, receiving recognition for their work both in the cattle industry and other areas. Today, just in the local area, the Blair descendants extend into the 6th generation. At this time, will all of the Blair descendants who are here today please stand? They each have their own story. At this time, I think my sister Janet has some information for us about the Guessing the Weight of the Bull contest.
Guessing the weight of the bull. She was a 4-year-old. His name was Bo Belford, and he weighed 2,700 pounds. And the nearest
Could you please repeat the weight?
2,700 pounds.
What was the guess?
What was the guess? 28?
Congratulations to the winner. Okay, and now we welcome your comments or questions.
First of all, let's give the presenters a round of applause. Excellent job, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank both of you and all of those who contributed. That was a wonderful
It was
presentation.
teamwork.
Good. Questions?
You know me, I'm not shy. Hi, I'm Kathy Beacheville, and I used to live in that very tall stone house on Davenport. And I was privileged, we were privileged to live next door to Lois and her daughter, Lucille. And the Presbyterian women decided they were going to try something new to raise money, and we started selling breakfast to bikers. Now, this was kind of a controversial thing. Some of those bikers were pretty tough, and some of them just looked tough. And at breakfast, which of course Lois was helping with, you would expect, she was pretty short. And she was walking by one table, and one of the guys in a black t-shirt just snarled at her, "Granny, bring me some more of them eggs." We all kind of held our breath because we weren't sure what kind of a reaction was going to happen in the room. She just walked by, patted him on the head, and said, "Just a minute, Sonny."
Others? Questions?
I'd just like to tell everyone that the story that you had referenced about Harry, I wrote that when I was an intern with the Meade County Times-Tribune newspaper 42 years ago. And so they had me go on the Volks March that year, and that's where I met Harry. And so it was just amazing. He was telling me his story as we walked, and so then I did a story that would have been, I think, June, and then he died that fall, right? In January, okay. So I was privileged to know Harry, and he, what was it, Ann? You said he cherished publicity. But, and then the irony is I married Jim Holland. We both work for the Rapid City Journal, and Jim did a wonderful story on George when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame, maybe, was that? I can't remember. But anyway, Jim did the story on George. So I have posted the story that I did on Harry on the city's Facebook page, and if you can blow it up and read it, it was fun to reminisce. And Ann Blair was actually an intern at the newspaper when I was there, and so I just took her under my wing, and we had a great time, and we're friends to this day.
Brian Cornelius, I'm Mary Beth's husband. My favorite story that I can recall, Harry, I guess, was about, 92 or 93, went up to Spearfish for a hot air balloon ride. And I think the police called her dad, George, and said, "You got to come up and get the keys away from him. He's run into a couple of cars already." So George went up there, and when Harry came down from the balloon, George said, I gotta take the keys, Dad. Harry said, "Well, how am I going to get up to my ranches to check on business?" "Well, the kids will drive you up." So anyway, George took the keys to the car, but Harry wasn't to be outdone. The next Monday, he went down to Rapid and bought another car.
Well, that reminds me of one of my favorite stories about Grandpa was somewhere along the line, somebody had done a carving, I guess it was, of him on a horse, about not real big, but anyway. And I saw it and I said, "Wow, that is really a great resemblance." And he looked at it for a minute and then he said, "Yeah, that horse just looks just like himself."
Other questions or comments?
Could all the Blair descendants stand up and introduce themselves?
Where do we want to start? Here.
I'm George's daughter, Nancy. I'm George's daughter, Kathleen.
I'm George's daughter, Ann.
I'm George's daughter, Mary Beth. Sometimes we call ourselves the Six Wicked Sisters.
And I'm George's daughter, Gayle.
Back there.
Yeah, I'm George's daughter, Janet, the oldest. My grandson, Jack.
Yeah, all the Blair descendants. I know there's more of you here.
And I'm Jeremy Urban, daughter of Gayle and my brother.
I'm Sean.
I'm Jonna, daughter of Ann.
I'm Rich Blair, son of Veldon, grandson of Enos.
I'm Ken Snyder, and my Enos would be my great grandfather, and my grandma was Janice Blair, Veldon's sister. And I have my son Daniel with me today.
And we have two of our youngest descendants here.
I'm Zach Seal.
Give it to Bella now.
I'm Boa.
Thank you. Oh, yeah.
One story that I remember my grandpa always talking about was whenever they first moved there, they had the bulls down there by the railroad track, there by the National Cemetery. And one of them, the train came by and blew the whistle, and the bulls broke out of the fence, and one of them broke his leg. And there wasn't any veterinarians in town, and so there was a new doctor that was in town, and they finally convinced him to come out and set the leg on the bull. And many of you probably know who the new doctor in town was W.E. Jones. So Jeannie, she wanted me to tell about our daughter, Kelly. I don't know where to start the story at, but Harry's Blair brothers, I think, originally owned that ranch in Harding County that Harry got the brand for, the Hackamore Ranch. And what to me is kind of interesting about the Hackamore Ranch was I looked in an old brand book, and the only brands that any of the Blair brothers ever had at that time was the Hackamore and the Quarter Circle 9. And I think the Quarter Circle 9 came from when they bought the original homestead and bought the cattle and the machinery, and I think they got the brand with it. Well, yes, we have that brand now, and we use it extensively, and I mean that's the main brand that we run. And now we've got it registered in Montana too, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, so Kelly got to dating a boy in Harding County by the name of Clint Dahl, and so she ended up marrying him, and they live on the ranch up there and in the house that George lived in. And you guys, some of you anyway, lived there. And so Doug, one time, you got to know Clint's dad, Doug Dahl, which would be Guy Dahl's son. He said, "Oh yeah," he said, "I spent 40 years trying to get the Blairs out of this ranch, and as soon as I get it paid off, well then, here they are back, wanting it back." And I told him, "That's not right." I said, "Blair's been tailing you up for 40 years. Still got to do it today."
Got to be some more stories here.
I'm Nancy Harlan, and I'm from Alkali. And when I saw that picture of the ice skating rink, I just loved it because that was the biggest deal. It was a social event. You know, my brother Ed and I would drive over there, and Joanne would come with her brother Dale and her sister Jean, and we'd skate around. And then sometimes later on, they'd play hockey. Later on, and then Ann Jeanette. I see the Snyders. Ann Jeanette always came. And we loved that place because, oh yeah, they had music, and they had this warm place that you didn't have to freeze in. And we were all used to skating on dams, and so they were all rough and bumpy, and you froze, and so this was like a luxury resort to us. It was just great. Yeah, it was wonderful.
Anybody else? Well, again, I want to thank the entire Blair. I don't know if you call them a family or a clan or exactly what, but and I think I can speak for a lot of people that have known the Blairs over the years, and just what a wonderful family, and what a contribution to our community and to the county and to the whole state. So thank you again for excellent presentation.